Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment webinar on inequitable access to water in the context of climate change. This is the fourth in our ongoing series of environmental justice aspects of climate change. Wonderful to welcome you here today. Before we start into the substance, I want to do a land acknowledgement of the native peoples on whose lands we're meeting today. Washington, D.C. sits on the ancestral lands of the Anacostans and the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. We gratefully acknowledge the native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities who make their home here today. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by three deep experts in water inequality: Chitra, Kumar, Khalid Osman, and Joe Kane. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, which for nearly 20 years now has been Stanford's marquee investment in delivering interdisciplinary research and practical solutions to important global problems related to climate, health, food, water, biodiversity. The Woods Institute is really a place where we take high-level concepts and try to give them traction on the ground, the kind of traction that my colleagues today have spent their careers developing. We're thrilled at the Woods Institute to be a founding pillar of Stanford's bold new Doors School of Sustainability, and trying to carry the banner of environmental justice along with our partners across the school. Today's session is on inequitable access to water, and we live in a society with centuries-long history of inequitable access to core infrastructure, but we know now that it's really exacerbated by interactions with climate change. Whether it's the mega drought that's currently influencing the Southwest or the massive floods that we're seeing in California and in other parts of the country. The challenges of dealing with inequality really come into focus when climate change sharpens their edges. And what we're finding now is that increasingly the dialogues about climate change solutions don't move unless they move on a foundation of environmental justice. And that's why I'm thrilled to be joined by three real experts. To my immediate left is Chitra Kumar, who's director of the Office of Policy, Partnerships, and Program Development in the US EPA. It's part of their larger infrastructure for dealing with environmental justice issues. Chitra has a 20-year career of working with the federal government to develop partnerships for equitable strategies, and her focus has really been on rural areas, small towns, and under-resourced areas in major cities. Next is Khalid Osman. Khalid is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford. And civil and environmental engineering is part of the Stanford Doors School of Sustainability, and Khalid is also a center fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. His focus is on public perceptions of water infrastructure, conservation, and increasingly his research focuses on equity in water infrastructure, affordability, and community access, and the way that relates to environmental justice. And then finally, Joe Kane, who's a fellow at Brookings Metro. His focus is on the built environment, especially transportation and water, and especially on opportunity and workforce, opportunity and resilience in workforce, and the implications of that for equity. The plan for today's event is that I'll ask questions of the experts for the first 20 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions on the floor. Especially with a small group like this, we'd love this to be an informal conversation that addresses the questions that are of greatest interest to you and go in the directions that provide the information that you need. Let me start with A question for Chitra. Can you help us understand the landscape of the inequality problem in water access, water reliability across the U.S. broadly?
Sure. First, I just want to thank you all so much at Stanford Woods for inviting me here. And it's really a pleasure to be joined here by the panelists to discuss a very important topic. So we know that there's been, as a consequence of redlining and other policies over decades, if not centuries, of exclusion or of exclusionary zoning that have set up our society to now have to address these challenges, really retrofitting on top of existing infrastructure. So the water systems were built when there was funding to actually build water treatment plants and systems on top of where people lived. And in some cases, those pipes didn't extend to the communities that were redlined and concentrated into neighborhoods that were Black, brown, Oriental. These are words that we know were used in even in zoning and permitting decisions to talk about things like smells, odors, and associated with pretty derogatory language about certain types of people. And this is what the world was like. And at that time, that was acceptable. And so, as a consequence today, we have a lot of issues. Maybe the most well-known with water access is lead contamination. A lot of those issues. Flint is the most well-known one. And in a recent talk from another environmental justice leader, really talked about how Flint sort of broke open the justice equity questions in environment for the country, made it be mainstream media picking up on the issue and really trying to cover those issues. Just as a note on that, 30 years ago when the environmental justice program started at EPA, by advocacy of civil rights leaders who came out of the civil rights movement, started pushing for attention on this racial discrimination issues as a part of environment. They really organized and got this environmental justice office set up at EPA. Incidentally, we call it the first equity office in all of federal government because it was actually called the Office of Equity. And now we have all over the country and lots of governments starting up these equity offices. So we lay claim to that in federal government anyway. But those civil rights leaders really wanted EPA to turn its attention to these issues. The water crisis and the issue at that time, there were only a few publications about discrimination in environmental sector. Now, and because of things like Flint, there's tens of thousands of citations around environmental justice out there. The attention is really there on it. So, just a couple of citations or a couple of things that might be of interest. So, Flint is one example, but this lead contamination issue has come up in Benton Harbor, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey. I'm sure many others. Philadelphia. There's an example of how schools in the city of Philadelphia. There's data on. In Newark, New Jersey, 17 schools tested positive for lead contamination in drinking water during Newark's lead crisis. And if you overlay those schools with the redlining maps, there's a really high correlation. So just to give you an idea, like today, even today, those communities are facing the outcomes, including fears about high blood lead levels. So that's one example. I would say the other thing in terms of what we have to contend with is where communities were cited relative to the floodplain. Often, Black and brown communities were segregated into the parts of the city that were low-lying. So when you talk about who gets flooded first as a consequence of changing climate patterns and increased hurricanes, other natural disasters, it's usually those communities that had it worse to begin with and have the least capacity to actually pay for recovery. So one example that sticks in my mind is FEMA. You know, they're the Federal Emergency Management Agency that ends up paying for recovery oftentimes. They will only let you, one, build back to the standard that your building was to begin with, and secondly, they usually only pay for half. What can you, if your house was only worth $10,000, what's $5,000 going to get you? Is it going to get you a home if it gets destroyed? And usually that's what we hear from our communities that have EJ concerns. So those are just a couple of thoughts.
Khalid, let me sort of continue to pursue this theme of understanding how we got to where we are. And when we look at the kinds of issues that Chitra has already talked about, can you help us understand sort of which of those are a result of bad initial design, which are a result of not investing in maintenance, which are a result of communities of color being located in areas that have the oldest infrastructure? How did we get here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is all of the above, right? You have, as Chitra mentioned, areas that are never connected to the systems. And then you have areas where once they were connected using poor materials that later were found to be toxic, but then kept a secret. And then you have places like Flint where sources were changed and cities are thinking about alternatives because now they're shrinking, right? You have a lower user base using a system that was built for a larger user base, and now how do you account for that? You think about alternatives. In the case of Flint, they thought about an alternative source, not understanding what that would do to the distribution system. But in other cities, it's that they're shutting off people. I mean, the big issue in Detroit right now is water shutoffs because people can't afford it. In some places, it's, lead is a big topic right now, but in other places, there's other contaminants that are harming communities that's not getting as much media attention, and so that's been a big issue. And so in terms of how did we get here, I think a conversation we were having at the table before we came up on stage was that as societies have shifted and changed, water systems have sort of maintained the same infrastructure. They haven't changed with society, whether that's population growth or population shrinkage. And that's a huge issue when you think about how water systems are maintained and operated. It's through user base. And so now if you have a smaller user base paying for this system that was designed for a larger user base, you have a really small revenue stream. And right now the major sources for water utilities to access resources is through the state revolving fund. And in a quick study we did in Detroit, what we found is that a lot of white communities are really good at getting money from the state revolving fund, but a lot of black communities or other ethnically diverse communities are very bad at getting money from the state revolving fund. And so setting up different types of grant programs, I think, would be a better path forward. But then I think that comes back to something maybe Joe will talk about, which is technical capacity within these jurisdictions. So.
Actually, and I was going to ask Joe specifically about that. There is a lot of funding for infrastructure in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act. And are we on the cusp of really addressing a lot of these issues, or are we still burdened by the lack of capacity that Khalid has spoken of?
Yeah, no, I thanks again to the Woods Center for hosting this event, for having me. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's the elephant in the room. We're literally blocks from the White House. We're blocks from the Capitol building. It's kind of unavoidable. But to talk about it, Chitra obviously and EPA are in the middle of this, to say nothing of many other agencies. But this federal funding, while once in a generation, I mean it is on par with my colleagues and I have looked at it compared to even the New Deal. I mean, we are talking about New Deal era levels of federal investment here. Even that pales in comparison to the scale of the challenges that we're describing, and it isn't going to be just a one-time infusion that's going to solve this, because at the end of the day, the owners and operators of these systems are at a state and local level. So in as much as there is a national scale to all of this, huge challenges for many decades that have been evolving, getting worse. it's not like the federal government by itself is just going to have a silver bullet to kind of solve all of this. Will this extra money help? Yes, but the problem is we're jamming this money. I kind of think of it as like a square peg in a circular hole. We're kind of jamming this money in a broken system programmatically. That I mean, we are still planning and designing many of these systems in the same way we did 50 plus years ago, which we can realize what are the outcomes of that. It's marginalized and quite frankly hurt a lot of communities. And that says nothing of the aging infrastructure that we see across the country. It's a moving target. There's a hyper level of fragmentation to these systems. I mean, 50,000 plus water utilities across the country, highly uneven capacities, technically, programmatically, fiscally, to address these issues. So, I think there's hope and promise certainly in the nature of the funding of going out there, of prioritizing, as Chitra was describing, prioritizing some of these issues around environmental justice, planning around people, not just projects, but planning around people. I think there's hope of that. But is this one-time infusion going to solve everything? No. But how can it provide places that extra flexibility to maybe experiment with new approaches? I think that's part of the hope. But a lot of places are behind the 8 ball here, and there's a lot of work to do that's going to go beyond even just the next 5 to 10 years.
Chitra, you were mentioning while we were eating that EPA isn't always the most loved agency in Washington. And when you talk to stakeholders around the country, especially in some of these communities that have been historically marginalized in terms of their water infrastructure, are you finding that there's a real a recognition of the problem and an appetite to fix things and an appetite to build partnerships with the federal government and the entities that have control of the resources?
Yeah, so we have a couple of ways that we get input from community leaders. So we have a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and then we have public meetings all the time where people can come in and tell us what they believe and what they're seeing. And we really listen to what they talk about. They have a water infrastructure focus. Actually, we have a meeting today and tomorrow where we're talking about these issues. And the things that get raised, and I want to give them credit for raising these issues to us. So there really is a bit of a hesitation or a trust issue with any public institution, because historically, not all institutions have had an incentive or have had great practices of engaging communities, even especially in the communities that have been marginalized historically. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of skepticism that this money is going to reach the places that need it the most. And then, part of that too is, we were also talking around the table about this issue of there may be, with this administration, a great interest in raising up concerns about equity and justice. There's all these measurements like Justice 40 and these executive orders that are lifting up those needs, including around systematic racism, which are fantastic to really elevate these issues. They're being done at the federal level. There's a lot of questions on how states are going to adopt them, and states are the ones in control of the state revolving funds. They have their own legislation, they have their own political interests, and then through that filter, the local utilities get their money. They have to all compete for the money, and then there are these grants which don't have to be paid back, which is fantastic, but they're still subject to the competitive nature of it, which states control. So what is the definition of a disadvantaged community? There's still only a fixed pot of money, and a disadvantaged community, I hate using that term, but that's the one that's in the legislation. We have to come up with a way to favor the communities that have historically been left out if we're ever going to get through this issue. Because we know that the wealthier communities can pay for expensive consultants to put the best applications together to get the money. We know that historically, this is just the truth. For any of us, if you have to put together a mortgage application for your home or something, you need a certain amount of capacity to be able to, amount of knowledge about how to navigate these complex processes, how to get on the state IUPs, the intended use plans, like all of these things. And then also like the real needs of communities often get dismissed. I just want to go back to this issue of, you mentioned the shutoffs. There's a really powerful story I heard, I think it was Cincinnati, where the director of the utility found out that shutoffs were happening at a disproportionate rate in the minority communities because it was easier for the people whose job it was to go out there to shut off multiple rental units water. It's faster, right? You go out there, you do a couple of those, and then you head back, than it was to do it in the suburban neighborhoods. Whereas the low-income neighborhoods had the least capacity to pay to get their water turned back on. And so they figured out how to actually, how to correct for that, because it cost the utility money to keep going out to that neighborhood and turning off and on the water. And so they corrected for that in a way. But that was an institutional fix that required somebody to figure that out and change the rules of the game to create an equal playing field, taking into account these things. And like, that's what it's gonna take. And it's not easy. And it's gotta take will.
And in general, just help me understand the way municipal water systems are governed. Is the governance usually at the level of whatever the city is or the town, or is there any regional planning on water infrastructure?
I think it's a mix, but I would actually defer to my colleagues here to share a little more of their details.
Yeah, I would also say it's a mix. It depends. You have some transboundary water sharing across, county lines or state lines. But as Joe mentioned earlier, there's 50,000 utilities, and so on. Some of these aren't urban areas, they're rural areas. Some of them are private well owners who are, if you have a private well in your backyard, you're your own water system. Some of them are smaller communities, some of them are larger communities, and so I would say it varies. But the governments, at least at the urban level, in my experience, it's managed by if we think about the Bay Area where we're from, you have the SFPUC, so San Francisco Public Utility Commission, which manages water for all of the Bay Area water providers. And so the decision for allocation and things like that comes from SFPUC and gets distributed to the smaller water utilities, the Palo Altos, the East Bays. And so that's one sample of a regional. But where I'm from, which is Portland, Oregon, you've got the city of Portland who manages their own water. That's coming from the Bonneville, from the watershed, but it's managed at the utility level, and so I would say it varies, but maybe you have.
Yeah, it depends in the sense of, and let's be clear, when we say water as kind of a catch-all for all of this, drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, green infrastructure. There are so many different types of systems and facilities we're talking about with these concerns, and so. The geography of these systems, the service areas of these systems may not even line up with the political jurisdictions and boundaries. Our watersheds do not neatly fit how our census geographies are determined. And so in as much as I've been in some places where the wastewater utility does not often even talk to the drinking water utility. And I'm in the room and they're kind of shaking hands for the first time and I'm perplexed. I can't believe it. Yet the governance of all of this is so fractured and siloed. But I think what we're talking about, there needs to be scale to not just these conversations, but to these actions and how we measure a lot of these issues too. There has to be accountability to how any of these improvements and investments are actually taking place. And as Chitra was describing, there's a challenge just to get this, like federally anyway, just to get the money out the door and provide technical assistance to communities that don't even have a grant writer to get this money. There's a whole other question of long-term planning and actual strategic, action that places need to take beyond the next 5 to 10 years that is just totally flies in the face of how they're organized and how they've operated for a very long time. But there needs to be regional scale. And there is some precedent for that, but it's unfortunately few and far between.
I would like to talk a little more about the institutional basis for the decision-making, particularly in the context of climate change. There are a whole new set of issues where entities wouldn't be expected to have any of the important expertise. And is your sense of the institutional framework now that we can sort of do tweaks around the edges, or do we need fundamentally new institutions to tackle these problems? And Joe, it's kind of continues the theme you've been discussing.
Yeah, no, I'd be curious what Chitra and Khalid have
Yeah.
to say about this. Look, I think the urgency of the moment demands more structural change. That just simply toying with the edges of what we're doing is probably not going to be good enough. Yet the reality, again, the money is already flowing out there. We can't just turn off the water. Like, we kind of have to do open heart surgery as like everything is functioning. So you can't just like completely turn everything around. That just is not going to happen. I think it's easy enough, to have like DC happy talk and sit on a stage and say, oh, it's all going to change,
Yeah.
and like this money is transformational, and we're going to do equity. Like, if you go on the ground in different places, like there are real struggles just to keep what we have going in the sense of like, I say like wad up the chewing gum and put the duct tape on like what we have. Like, it's a challenge for places even to do that, yet alone like go in and say, oh yeah, you need to prioritize different people. It comes across as a little, I'm not saying that is important, it's just tone deaf to the realities on the ground in a lot of places. So, and then you add on sort of the climate layer to all of this, where it's not like a nice to do, it's a must do, I would argue, in a lot of places. I think, a lot of places are on their heels, kind of being caught off guard with this. I mean, we were just talking at the table before this. I mean, California a few years ago was all about the drought, not enough water, and now we got all this water coming in. And so there has to be some intentionality and purpose to the sort of the planning that we have to do around this. It's not going to change in the next year or two, but what are going to be these incremental steps we can take now that are going to start to get the reps in, that this is just how we do it, and then we can build momentum, hopefully, for that transformational change we need.
I promise we'll have another drought in California, by the way. Chitra, go ahead, Khalid.
Yeah, just to add to something I think Chitra mentioned earlier, which is that there was originally this large pot of money for these water systems to originally be built, right? Mm-hmm. And that pot of money didn't come with support structures. It came with, here's the money to build out your infrastructure, and then now it's on to you and your ratepayers to maintain, operate, and continue to improve upon the system. And I think that system in itself was a broken one. And I think in terms of thinking about new governance structures, I mean, I definitely agree with you. We're a little tone deaf going in and saying we need to prioritize equity, but I do think that a new institution or a new governance structure is needed to where, water systems aren't being funded by loans. And I know they're low interest loans at the state revolving fund, but some communities don't have the capacity to ever pay that back. And some water utilities are consistently functioning in deficit, right? And so I would say as climate change continues to challenge water in many ways, whether it's too much or too little, we're going to need either new institutions or a new paradigm shift on how water systems are managed across the U.S. That'd be my perspective. But
Chitra, do you see new institutions evolving? And can you put that in the context of how you personally and the EPA think about water as a fundamental right?
Yeah, this is tough, and I'm going to talk from my perspective as a student of urban planning and smart growth and like land use issues too. So my previous job was thinking about sort of better ways of building, our communities in order to be more equitable, to be more sustainable long term, and I think about it as, right now, all of those decisions are relegated to local communities, and if they don't have good data to be able to make smart fiscal decisions, to be able to continue to have thriving communities where they can meet all their citizens' needs, they're going to make ill-informed decisions. And so the classic example is most communities think of growth, economic growth, as a good thing. Part of the strategy is annexing other parts of the community to become bigger. Well, every part of their, every concentric circle around their core infrastructure that they have as a city or a town, even small towns where they had like railroads, even like very small towns that I've visited, they grew up as a place to sell goods, for whatever population was there, probably around a railroad. There was some infrastructure base. And then because of the advent of the car and because of this idea of like, we want to see large expanse, they build out further. Well, who's going to provide them the clean water for that, and wastewater, unless they're on well? I mean, then there's a complicated set of issues there, and then you have tribes. Very few. My numbers here are 58 out of every 1,000 Native American households lack plumbing, compared to 3 in 1,000 white households. I mean, that's just. It just is a reality. Part of it is where were people relegated to living, and so I think that these land use patterns and the institutions that allow for that to continue, like every town that crops up a suburb, that crops up an exurb that's allowed to crop up, these things just make it structurally very difficult for us to manage growth in ways that are sustainable. Both, and I'm not even talking about environmentally sustainable, I'm talking about fiscally. We're going broke as a nation. I mean, there's plenty of research out there showing that. We have this crazy Ponzi scheme of growth. So I do think that, EPA is not going to come out there and say that. So I'm saying this to you as this is my personal belief. There are parts of EPA that will say that. We do try a lot to use the tools we have to manage these issues. Climate adaptation plans are a big thing we're pushing right now. We're trying to get communities to think regionally. We're trying to use levers. Every time we have a funding opportunity, we try to say, we've got to build in these considerations. Well, it's all code for we want you to work together better to make better decisions as a community. When we say equity, we want them to, and there are technical tools to do that. I've seen some fantastic 3D mapping applications that show historic investments in communities where those historic investments were made, how they're way more productive if you think about it per square foot than if you look at an exurb where that's a predominantly white community where people live really separate from each other, and all of those infrastructure costs, roads, and water have to get built out too. So I don't know. I think I answered your question.
Okay, well, yeah, that was terrific. Thank you so much. Khalid, Chitra just talked about the challenges that are associated with growth, but earlier you were talking about the challenges that are associated with shrinking communities, and many of the most blatant examples of water system problems recently have come from these shrinking communities. And are there special things that need to be done to urgently address the needs in areas that are losing population? And is there some kind of a path to financial viability for infrastructure in these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great research question. What we found in our research on shrinking cities is that, there needs to be multiple alternatives assessed before a decision is made. And I think what happens now, because when you talk about loss of population, you're also talking about loss of expertise. And so the people who have some of the historical knowledge often get up and leave with the jobs and leave with the population. And so you're leaving a brand new sort of group to manage this system that has some historical context. And I think the challenge there is that without that historical context, you make some ill-advised decisions going forward because you don't know the community, you don't know the system really well. And so I would say going forward, just having multiple perspectives when we're thinking about alternatives before a decision is made, and then being really proactive about this procedural justice, bringing the community in and grabbing the knowledge from the community and incorporating that into your design and operation decisions. I think that's a good path forward. In terms of fiscal viability, it's going to come down to removing parts of the system. I think that's the only way that you make it fiscally feasible is removing parts of the system. But then how do you choose which parts to remove? I think that's the challenge ahead, and we don't have an answer for that right now.
And by removing parts of the system, you really mean this is a part of the city that basically is not going to be available for living in.
Correct. Decommissioning parts. And
I want to spend just a few more minutes asking questions before opening it to all of you. But I would like to talk about the additional elements that climate change adds to the
Chris, can I add one last thing on that
Sure.
question in terms of fiscal viability? One of my first research papers was looking at willingness to pay. And what we found is that in Black and brown communities, we were looking across 21 shrinking cities, if there was an actual improvement, a measurable improvement in reliability and quality of their drinking water, they were willing to pay for it. And so to say that there's no fiscal viability is not the right answer, is that they want to see the results actually, they want to see the actions actually result in improved quality and reliability. And I think in that case, there is some leeway for future fiscal viability.
And I especially appreciate the emphasis on the procedural component, the engagement of the community in deciding what the pathway is going to be.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your question.
No, that's okay. Well, I did want to switch to talking about the new dimensions to the issues that climate change brings. And Joe, you started mentioning some of the issues that are going to need to be addressed. And that seems like a whole new set of expertise, even beyond the expertise that we're saying we already lack. And I wonder if you can comment on how we're going to bring in the knowledge necessary to design the water systems that aren't, for the 2020s, but are for the 2050s and beyond.
Yeah, well, I mean, climate, obviously, what I say, water policy is climate policy and vice versa. And I think there's this idea of climate is something extra special, and it's actually fundamental just how we do things, period. It's not like, oh, we have to radically transform, even just our thought process. I just want to get that clear, it's just doing what we're doing kind of better, more efficient, more equitable, more sustainable, more resilient, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Where I would actually say, yes, there is a need, particularly in terms of the staffing and the who is actually going to manage all of this. I think we're talking about communities kind of being acted upon and hearing from them. But the key is going to be actually involving communities to be part of this process, and not just in terms of come to a public meeting and we'll listen to you, actually demonstrating the value of their voice and their perspective in enacting this change. Because quite frankly, water is out of sight, out of mind for a lot of individuals, and yet, it's just so essential to our everyday activities. So the challenge, of course, is going to be growing the talent pool, and we think of the workforce for this, growing the talent pool, the talent pipeline, as I pun, play on words, the talent pipeline for this, because, and that involves certainly youth workforce engagement, younger people, and I think fortunately we're seeing a lot of that across the US and even globally of the engagement of younger people on these issues. But it's not just engaging, hey, let's just get a bunch of students exposed to kind of these careers and this work. It's also engaging mid-career individuals and managers of today and tomorrow as well, so hence the whole pipeline. And the danger is in that, we have such a hyper focus. I say this more like in Washington, talking to in other panels at the Department of Labor and Department of Transportation. It isn't like the water sector is alone in this. I mean, the skilled trades are dealing with a lot of these issues. There's such an emphasis on just the youth workforce angle to this, at the exclusion of we're having a challenge even just holding on to people we have right now. Great resignation issues, I think we read about in the news as, well, I don't like to go to the office. Well, problem is, if you're going to work for a water utility, you got to go to the office because your office is literally in the trench, or and in some cases you don't have to wear a hard hat, right? I mean, we need a lot of HR specialists, we need community outreach specialists, we need managers, we need engineers. There are so many pathways, multiple branching pathways here. And the challenge is a lot of people are leaving these positions because they're burned out, they're getting older. Our last hiring boom was really in the 1970s following the passage of the Clean Water Act. Wow. Do the math. I mean, we're coming up on 50 plus years here. I think a lot of people hung on following the 2008 recession. But that's a lot of, talk about, as Khalid said, knowledge loss, institutional knowledge, where we need to have transfer of that knowledge, succession planning, mentoring, that's just going out the door. So in as much as we're talking about these operational concerns and these sort of physical investments, very, very much matters who is going to be managing these, and not just, again, for the next few years, but for the next few decades.
Chitra, one of the things that's getting to be a more and more important theme in discussions about climate adaptation is strategic relocation, either having whole communities move to other locations or
Yes.
rearrange within the communities in order to have people out of harm's way. And I wonder if strategic relocation is playing an important role in the way EPA thinks about future regulations, and whether it makes things simpler or way more complicated.
Yeah, you asked some tough questions here.
Well, we're all friends here.
So the first thing that came to my mind when you asked the question about strategic relocation is just how many people are coming to us asking for those kinds of situations. It could be because of inundation of water from the frequent flooding related to climate change, or what have you, related to natural disasters. It could also be because of legacy pollution. That's another reason. There's some historic sites with legacy pollution centers that people are just, it seems as if the best option is to actually move people out rather than try to remediate all the contamination.
Yeah.
And so there are more conversations happening about that. In fact, we were talking with our lawyers about whether or not that's an allowable cost for some of our new grant programs under the Inflation Reduction Act. We're definitely hearing a lot of that. Now, is that working its way into how we're thinking about regulation? I'm not hearing that right now. I'm not saying that but I also don't know about every conversation with the regulatory process. It's actually something, EPA produces so many regulations every year, and we just recently got like 1.5 people to help do EJ analyses in these regulations. So I'm not saying that, but it's certainly something that I'll keep my ears on and come up with. I think it's going to have to be if it becomes something that's widespread. I mean, it's certainly like Alaska. We're hearing so much about that. Perhaps some of the other outlying lands. So,
Khalid, from your perspective, what are the key things that need to change if we're going to effectively embrace the understanding that climate's changing?
Yeah, I mean, can I add to the strategic
Please,
relocation
yeah.
conversation just really quickly? One thing that we found in Austin, Texas, when we were doing a study in Latinx communities, which were placed, for a long time in harm's way, which there was flooding. They were in, consistent flood zones, and their homes and their communities were rooted in these flood zones. And after a certain period of time, the floods got too bad and people were being strategically replaced. But the feedback that we were receiving from the community was that, yes, thank you for moving us to a different place, but now we've lost our social fabric, which was so important to us, that our resiliency, what we're assessing is, what does climate resiliency look like to you? And they said that our resiliency comes from, helping each other out and having this social fabric. And now that we've been spread out across Austin, we're no longer feeling like we're, resilient as a community. And so, I'm not a huge proponent of strategic relocation, but it is a process that needs to happen because of the original location. I mean, originally placing people in harm's way, the only way to get them out of there now is to, one, spend lots of money building infrastructure to prevent, to improve resilience and prevent, climate disaster, or to just get up and uproot entire communities. And so it's a cost-benefit analysis that needs to happen at a local scale. But just the feedback that we've gotten from communities that they don't appreciate that.
And your comment about the importance of maintaining the social fabric and community engagement in the decision about whether or not to move seem like they're fundamentally important. But it also is the case that climate change is really amplifying this risk of being in harm's way for especially people who are flood exposed or in California wildfire exposed. Let me turn now to questions from all of you. And I think the most efficient way to do this is just raise your hand if you got a question. We've got a mic runner, and since we are recording this, please wait till the microphone comes so that it's get picked up on the recording. Questions? Comments? Thank you for starting us off.
Thank you for your conversations, and if you can bring it back to strategic relocation and also potential policy levers. Chitra, you mentioned about building back better and the difficulties with building back better when it comes to like materials or so forth. And the question I have on that is, I guess, what other policy levers do we have? Are we thinking about when it comes to should we build back better, or should we also think about building back with adaptations in line? Or, maybe it's not strategic relocation, maybe it's not building back better in these locations. And then the question is, I guess a lot of these community members who are living in these areas are living them because of potentially affordability issues. And so can we have these type of conversations without thinking about even like market-based concerns or affordability, housing? I don't know, if you can speak to any of those points, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, should
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think this issue of how do you upgrade infrastructure without pricing people out is a super critical one.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions come up related to that. One issue is, are we doing something about it? I think your question of we point to that FEMA policy all the time, and I feel bad to throw my other federal colleagues under the bus. There are people who are very interested in reforming those policies to be more adaptive. Recognizing this. I mean, I've been in the federal government long enough. We've been talking about it for multiple administrations. Trying to figure out, well, what do you do? And then it comes to, well, what do you change it to? And how do you know you're not subsidizing then? How do you apply whatever policy broadly and essentially don't end up subsidizing someone whose multi-million-dollar home is going to just get upgraded, and continue to be in that floodplain, right? And then it gets to the strategic relocation question again. It's like, why are we continuing to rebuild homes that are prone to flooding and they're in beachfront property and Hurricane Sandy, there are so many stories about that, in Long Island and which communities got a lot of federal subsidies. So I think we're going to need a lot more engagement and conversation with more people in the room who, that's what I'm seeing now. We have a lot more with the intentionality around engagement, needing to have more inclusive tables that people are at to be able to provide feedback about how we should design these policies. So I am more hopeful than I've ever been, and I'm fairly cynical as a person. So I will say I'm more hopeful than I've ever been about things moving in the right direction. The right direction being to get to a place of a policy that's durable and sustainable and more equitable. So I lost the last part of your question, so I'm going to let my colleagues.
Actually, I would love to hear Joe's thoughts on this question of how you invest in adaptation without raising prices so much that people have to move away.
Thank you for raising, it's a really important question, and it goes way beyond just the public sector. Let me be clear, the private sector has enormous responsibility here. This goes beyond even just the water sector, by the way, too. This deals with land use, it deals with buildings, it deals with not just physical infrastructure, it deals with the insurance industry. It deals with literally our financial system and how it is fundamentally designed, in that we have for years encouraged just endless sprawl and just building really vulnerable development. You look at Colorado, you look at Florida, it's all over the country, and we are not at all internalizing, if that's even the right word, internalizing the costs and risks of this prevailing nature of development. Now, the federal government, and I've had conversations with folks at Department of Commerce. This goes beyond EPA, by the way. SEC, I think, has a role in this, in how actually our investments are structured and geared, because there is so much money beyond even just federal Washington And that's what the American public, like, is going to respond to, right, is the almighty dollar. Like, if I have to rebuild this over and over and over again, or it's going to cost me more money, same thing for utilities too. If I have to keep doing this, it's more expensive, why am I still doing it, right? I need to change my behavior. How are you going to get behavior change is through those incentives, right? So it's kind of a combination of carrots and sticks, right, where we have some sticks, especially in like the European context, I think just culturally, like there's more of an acceptance of like, no, we need to like change our behavior, and there's like the sticks will work. I think the US, a lot more of carrots are gonna be necessary, and carrots for individual homeowners, carrots for industry to actually alter their behavior. Because the price tag for all of this is so enormous. I mean, we're talking trillions. Like, so we're like, this goes beyond even just one surge in federal funding. We have got to get the private sector involved in this as well.
If I may add just a really small example where I've seen this sort of done a little well. In Portland, when I was working for contractors, one thing that would happen is that to get a permit to develop a new property, you had to improve all the infrastructure around that property, and that was a policy that was in place. And I thought it worked well, but then it doesn't get at your other question of, how do you prevent that from pricing people out? If I'm building this, brand new condo or apartment complex that's going to be charging people $3,000 a month for rent, when it used to be $500 for rent, but I'm also improving your roads and your pipes, it's a really hard balance for, I think, cities to say no. But you're right, it doesn't get at all the issues. And I've seen some good policy and I've seen some not so great. So,
Another question. Maybe while people are thinking, I'll dig a little deeper into this issue of gentrification that you sort of started us along the lead in. And how do you think about the pathway to build better communities that aren't more expensive communities? And it seems like gentrification has been so pervasive in so many parts of the country that we don't really have a recipe.
So this issue of, there's the gentrification, and then we also talk about like anti-displacement policy sometimes, where communities are trying to achieve what you just said. Some people talk about community benefits agreements attached to building or development. This issue of like green gentrification comes up a lot. Like when we have more green infrastructure in places, it actually makes a community more beautiful and attractive, and then you attract in a lot more high-priced housing, and it has to be, I think, a community deciding when there's major redevelopment opportunities that they're going to have inclusionary options for housing, and that those benefits they're hard fought and hard won and maintained by those communities. And the examples that I know of are because the community demanded it. If there was nobody fighting it tooth and nail at every step of the development process, they didn't get it. And so, from our perspective in the environmental justice, external civil rights program, it's trying to get our money out on the ground. So we have $3 billion of IRA funding to get out in environmental and climate justice grants. And it's just to try to make sure that that money is going into the communities that need it most, so that they can have a voice, they have the capacity to sit at more tables to demand what they deserve. And like that's one tool, but of course like $3 billion is nothing relative to the level of incentives. Even just EPA got $60 billion for other kinds of climate investments, and not to even speak of the rest of the federal government and what Joe spoke about with like the financial system and the private sector and everything else. So, it's not everything. It's got to be a multi-pronged process, but it has to include more citizen action.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot bundled in your question, Chris, in the sense of like gentrification is obviously its own huge ball of wax. I think there's something about pricing though in general, and pricing, I would argue for some of these climate issues we're talking about, if it is more expensive to build somewhere because like the insurance won't cover it or like we have to keep rebuilding, that's actually a good thing. Like the market is sending a signal that we should not build here. And that actually, if prices are distorted and artificially low where people find it more affordable, let's say to live in a floodplain, like that isn't right either, right? So like the market signals are so distorted here. And there needs to be an understanding. I don't, like this is something that I'm just really interested in at almost a granular level geographically. Are we even measuring this? Because there is no good data. I mean, the insurance industry is sitting on a ton of this information, by the way. Obviously, they're not sharing it because it's for their business purposes. But we need to get extremely granular on this to like the point of individual parcels. Like I don't know if you look at like Redfin, right, where there's now like a flood sort of factor or like other risk scores. Like that's the level of detail we need to be able to price this adequately for different people and then make the appropriate policy response. Because otherwise we're just throwing money out there to try to solve this and like engaging people like, yeah, do you see all these challenges? Of course they're gonna say they do. But what's gonna lead to a change is there has to be accountable benchmarks, right? Of what is the status quo and how are we changing that? So I go back to kind of, the point before of it is not just going to be, led by itself like in federal Washington. It has got to involve state and local action, and it's got to involve private sector action on this as well.
Khalid, did you want to comment on the gentrification question?
I mean, I think everything that I would have said has been said.
Yeah. Another question from the audience?
Can I go back to a discussion that happened on new governance structures that I think there was sort of a consensus?
Please.
But we have, in the water sector, the fragmentation gives an opportunity for consolidation or regionalization or shared services. There are different forms and structures to it. And that has been, that's worked in many places. I wouldn't say that's a cure-all for everything. Benton Harbor is a great example, which used to have a combined system serving not just its own city, but the suburbs nearby. And the white suburbs simply broke away from that system because they did not want to be saddled with that burden of the old infrastructure. And then when Benton Harbor had its own problem, everyone said, hey, let's consolidate. And they were like, no, we don't. So that it doesn't work everywhere, but it has shown benefits in terms of reducing cost, bringing new labor. I know Joe has written extensively on this. I'm wondering if there's an answer there somewhere.
Yeah, I can take
Joe,
a first crack,
please,
but I'd be curious what others think. So I feel like consolidation was a 4-letter word a few years ago. Still is probably in some ways, like for some water sector folks. And a lot of what we're talking about, by the way, straddles urban and rural geographies. And so like consolidation obviously has been more of a consideration, I think, I'm generalizing here, but like in rural geographies where you have very small systems, population loss, like who is gonna work for these things, like financially there's not enough money, like let's band together. I know this has happened in Pennsylvania. What was probably if you had this event 5 years ago, everyone would be talking about public-private partnerships, and yet that is like not mentioned at all. Understandably, because like there's a huge infusion of like federal resources now. So I think consolidation should be on the table just out of necessity. Now, how that takes shape is obviously going to be like regionally dependent. How that takes shape in terms of, I think there's concerns of like affordability, like we were talking about before. It's hard to say there's a one-size-fits-all approach to that, but I think your point is important in the sense that there have to be alternative sort of governance frameworks around all of this, and just kind of business as usual is not going to work in a lot of places where you can kind of see like where the future is going to lie like 5 years down the road as population loss keeps continuing. And state leaders, for what it's worth, I was just saying this at the table before we came up here, I was in Kentucky a few years ago. It's not a question of if there's going to be system failure, it's a question of when. And so state leaders have to kind of, they know this is coming. And so they're trying to get ahead of it. And these are the sorts of issues they're talking about in terms of operation, maintenance, and not even just new system sort of construction or replacement, but actually just operation and maintenance.
Yeah. Chitra, there's a lot of reason to think that economies of scale could be real, but at the same time, this goes back to the issue you raised initially about trust in the federal government and in the governmental system. And what's the pathway for reconciling those conflicting priorities.
Yeah, I saw you leaning in, so
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize, Glee.
you know, there's only going to be trust if there's transparency in our decision making. And I think historically, every layer of government could probably do a better job in sharing even how our budgetary decisions are made, how policy decisions are made. I think there's often, and I've experienced this in my own career in terms of like the level of information that we're willing to put out there about what we know, even when we know something. Like, are we willing to share with the public? There's a fear. Public leaders often are very fearful of the backlash, and it doesn't actually end up going well usually when we hide things, right? A la all of these water system failures. And so what I would say is, if there's a contemplation of a consolidation deal going on, there needs to be some level of sharing of that information and getting public input on it. Now, the incentives are not aligned, though, because you want to have the deal get done. There's a bunch of other scenarios that need to be dealt with. But at the same time, the people whose lives are going to be affected because they're going to be ratepayers, et cetera, for a public good. You know, you asked earlier about this, like, right to water. I mean, there's definitely a hunger for that approach, for us to say, like, communities deserve clean water, everyone. So how do we get there? How do we reconcile that when we're paying for it, when there's these sort of other interests? So I just go back to, like, we've got to get to a place where public budgets are way more transparent than there's way more ability for citizens to engage in the process of divvying out infrastructure. And then for us to set policies with that level of engagement.
Glad I cut you off.
Oh no, you're totally fine. I mean, two things. One, on this issue of water being a right, I think it's a challenge. I've had a utility manager tell me, you know, if water's a right, you know, the river's right there. Why don't you just go and get it? You know, why don't you just tell people to go get it? And I mean, I think, you know, their perspective on that was it takes money to put in the infrastructure to get the water from the source and deliver it to you in a clean manner. And so that's I think where, you know, water being a right becomes a challenge. But on this issue of consolidation, you know that the State of California Water Board mandates consolidation. If smaller community water systems are failing, they have to consolidate with the larger water utility. But what we've seen in California is that since that mandate has been in place, there's actually been more voluntary consolidations. The challenge we have, though, is that there's not a lot of data on what happens to those systems once they've consolidated. We've been looking everywhere for data. You know, has the quality improved? Has it become more affordable? Are the residents actually happy with the new water system? And we just don't have that data right now. So I think that's been a major challenge. But you mentioned the Great Lakes example. And we do have a little bit of just anecdotal data from there, where we're hearing community members say, well, we've lost agency in our water system because now we're a part of this large conglomerate, whereas before we had a smaller water system. And so I don't know if consolidation is favored everywhere, but I mean, the two examples that I know of are California and then the Great Lakes area, and in both, it seems like there's opposing views. So.
We're getting close to the end. I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll give each of you a chance to make a closing thought. Yeah, Connor?
Hi, yeah. I have a question about kind of the kind of like the desire or need for real public input and real public engagement, and like simultaneously the kind of out of sight, out of mind status of water. So like I know, Joe, you mentioned both of those things. So like, how do you get people to engage like in something that they're not really thinking about, especially not on like a day-to-day basis when things are going well, like, but there are decisions being made. Like, it just seems difficult to get people up to a level of technical, like, understanding that there can be meaningful public engagement or meaningful public input in these things. So are there any ideas to overcome that kind of contrasting challenge?
Who wants to tackle that one?
I can kick it off quickly, but yeah, no, I mean, you're right. And this idea of visibility is obviously ongoing. I think it matters who's the messenger in some ways for this too. Where, most people, I don't know about you all, I mean, it's like, how do you think of your water? It's like, well, I can turn it on, it's there, it works. And then when there's a problem, right, is usually when there's visibility. It's like, oh, there's a disruption, or there's my service is canceled, or my bill got raised. There's usually sort of a negative connotation with that visibility, but we need obviously positive connotation. And so I give some credit to the utilities themselves, DC Water actually being one of them, of being more proactive, of saying, hey, you're getting value. I think it's value for water, right? There's a whole value for water campaign actually out there, so there is some efforts being led by utilities themselves, demonstration projects, for example. If you're going to install a rain garden in a community, maybe that's an exposure point, right, for people in that community to understand, oh, this is a water thing, I didn't even know that, right? You can even literally see little signs. I don't know if you see even in DC on some streets, you'll see a little sign saying this is a rain garden. Yeah. And this is what it's supposed to do. I think that's awesome, right? Just be little things like that can make it. It doesn't have to be a formal huge report, or just little constant reminders to people that this is adding value to your community, and that when you're paying into it, you're getting value out of it beyond just the basic service. And so there are other examples I can cite. Baltimore has a rebranding strategy too, which sounds kind of trite. It's well, okay, yeah, just rebrand. So I think they have a YH2O campaign particularly for youth workforce or student sort of outreach, which is cool. So some of this stuff doesn't even take a lot of money, right? But it's just smarter and just being more proactive and visible about these things. So those are just a couple examples I'd cite.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's one of our largest gripes as civil engineers in general is that, everything that we do goes underappreciated until something goes wrong. So you think about the bridge you cross every day or the road you drive on every day, unless there's a pothole or a collapse, no one really cares that it's there or that they're paying into it. And so, but I think the challenge there is that that's almost made us feel like we need to always be reactive. And I like what Joe said is that we shouldn't be reactive to infrastructure failing. We should be proactive and be able to predict when it's going to happen and prevent it from happening. Because when it does happen, it impacts, as you know, entire societies, and so entire communities, neighborhoods, and in some cases, entire cities or even countries. So I think the one thing I would say is for all the engineers in the room is ensure wherever you go that you're thinking about being proactive and always thinking 5, 10, 15 years ahead. Otherwise, you'll set yourself back 5, 10, 15 years. So.
Well, let me thank you all for a wonderful series of insights and invite a closing thought. And maybe you should answer the question that I should have asked but didn't. I don't mean to be cryptic about that. Whatever you'd like to say for a closing thought.
All right. So there are, to me, I've done some international travel, and I'm always, whenever I come back, so grateful that we can drink tap water here. And yet, not all communities can. And there are parts of the country where people don't have tap water. And when I learn about the numbers, it's way more than it should be for a developed country that has as much affluence as we have and as many billionaires as we have in this country. And the idea of access for all is a tenet of this administration. How to do that, we have multiple funding flows, for federal funding flows, as we've all mentioned, and Joe knows the numbers back and forth. This is an unprecedented, historic time, level of investment from the federal government, and it's not enough to address all of the needs of communities. Ultimately, all the needs of communities, we are going to need to work together to make a change, because status quo is way easier. There are a lot of thoughtful people. I am hopeful because we are providing job opportunities in these fields more than we ever have before. It's astounding to me. I learned recently that the largest growth job title, if you go to the hiring websites, is actually equity officer. So there is a recognition that we as a society need to contend with these issues, that we need to make changes, and there is actual capacity being built because we're hiring people who will have the knowledge and the skills to address them in the way they deserve. And yet, there's still more, much, much more that we have to do. And so I'm just appreciative that we're all contending with it together. None of us are going to find the solution on our own. It's going to take tremendous collaboration. It's going to take fits and starts, trials and errors. And that's the way this society has been built. Like America has been built in that way. And sort of recognizing that, I think, is where my hope is. And around addressing the climate challenges, the other day we had a national hiring effort for environmental justice specialists, and we got 1,000 applications in 5 days. So we have young people who are ready and interested in making a change and making a difference in this country. So,
Thank you, Chitra. Khalid.
Yeah, my answer and question isn't as elaborate. I love that you had Chitra start. Not a great following act, but I'm just kidding. The question I probably would have asked myself is, how do we all define equitable access? And for me, it's a fair distribution of both, benefit and burden. And I think what we've talked about today on stage is a lot of the burden, but I know that looking ahead, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for benefit. And so how do we keep I don't want to use the word disadvantaged communities, but minoritized and disadvantaged communities at the forefront when we're thinking about some of the benefits that are upcoming in addressing a lot of these issues of access. And so, that's what I would say is let's think, how do we make sure that people are involved in the benefits that come with a lot of the resources that are being put forth.
Thank you, Khalid. Joe.
Yeah, well, thanks again, Chris, for moderating. Thanks to Chitra and Khalid, too. It's been a great conversation. I feel like we could be here for much, much longer.
That's for sure.
But no, I'll just add reaching more in different types of people. And by that, I mean, obviously, probably have a lot of water nerds like in the in the crowd who actually found it important to come in person to this. But reaching those beyond even the water sector on these issues, political leadership, community-based organizations, workforce development organizations. This is a conversation that should not just be for water utilities to kind of do this stuff, or just up to EPA or whatever else. I mean, this needs to be all hands on deck. And ideally, when we put all those hands on deck, it's different types of people are involved here: women, people of color, those communities that have been, quite frankly, hurt in both unintentional and intentional ways because of some of the issues that we're talking about. And I think I'm at least hopeful that some of this funding anyway provides at least an opportunity to loosen the belt a little bit and experiment, hopefully, with some new approaches and hopefully. Make some changes that we haven't been able to do for some time.
Well, thanks again to all of you. This is a super interesting conversation, at least for me, the sense of dealing with the juxtaposition of the extra resources, the historical inequities, and the need for real engagement. It creates a compelling but complicated landscape, and your comments have helped me think about ways to navigate that. Thanks to all of you for allowing us to share our thoughts with you. And thanks especially to the great Wood staff that made this possible: Lee Rosenbaum, Kamaya Daniels, Roberta Tugendreich, Molly Field, and Celia Price. So thanks again for joining us, and join me in thanking all of the speakers.